Hey everybody, we'll just get our slides up and kick off. Slightly different subject here this afternoon. Well, it's early evening here in the UK. Yeah, just changing it. There's been a lot of technical talk, so we're going to just move on a bit. So how are we going to start with a bit of a show? Get your clicky fingers out and either, I don't know if you can stick your hands up, but a bit of a reaction to some of these questions.
Sure. Should we just introduce ourselves first, Alison?
Yeah, I just realised. Dan is pausing
right.
on this slide to remind me that we haven't introduced. That's difficult when you've got two people and somebody goes off script. Go for it, Dan.
It's all good. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's really nice to have you here. My name's Dan Watson. I started my FinOps journey about 3 years ago. Before that, I'd literally never heard the term before in my life. So I'm relatively new to the discipline. And yeah, I'm joined here by Alison. She is our Cloud Economics Director at Capgemini Invent, where I also work. She's got a wealth of experience in FinOps across both industry and consulting. And basically, we're here today to talk to you. Well, I've always been interested in kind of behavioral science and how we can work with the way people think rather than against the way people think, and then how we can use that to get the change that we want to see. And it's kind of in that spirit that we're talking with you today. So yeah, over to you, Alison, to get into what you were trying to get into just now.
Yeah, I kicked off too quickly. So have a quick read of these questions. But we're talking about whether you've had really good exec sponsorship until you come to ask them to really take a hard stand, or you've got really good recommendations and everybody agrees to them, but it takes forever to get them done, or a fab dashboard or tooling and no traffic to it. If that's resonating with any of you, please give us a reaction. Or if it's not resonating with you, that might be because you're so incredible and awesome, but you might be lucky. Or if I asked you incredible, awesome people who don't have these issues, how did you do that? How did you get the culture? How did you get the behavior? I wonder if you would have tangible things other people could do.
Exactly.
So dive into it.
Yeah, I hope that just gives you, hopefully there's some kind of common challenges that maybe resonate with people. But basically, as I was kind of looking through when I was getting my practitioner certification, and I was looking through the second edition of Cloud FinOps, and when I was kind of expecting it to tackle what I think is the hardest question, which is how do we make FinOps behavior stick? How do we make sure that when the FinOps team aren't in the room, people are still doing what we want them to do? But as I was kind of reading through it, I realized something that I at least found interesting. And to me, it seems like FinOps is really rich in its practices, but quite thin in how we get that transformation going. Throughout the book, you kind of see that it defines what needs doing and who should do it. And there's kind of some tactical steps, some quick wins, some kind of small hows. But to me, what seemed like it was missing was a repeatable, adaptive, and end-to-end how, which is kind of like a model for how culture actually changed. So the way I kind of explain that is, to me, FinOps seems to know the nouns, it knows what, it knows who, and there's a little bit of how, but it doesn't really seem to know the verbs. So there's no big picture how do we sustain, how do we evolve FinOps? And so I guess ultimately that comes down to the missing architecture of change. So when you look at FinOps as it is now, it seems like it's really solid in areas, but yeah, the cultural architecture isn't really there. So let's break this down into a few different levels. But at the strategic level, FinOps has got really good, strong principles. We talk about transparency, we talk about accountability, we talk about collaboration, and those are all really, really important things. And we also talk about the roles, and the governance is clear. We know who meets who, and we know why they meet. But that's kind of where it stops. It doesn't tell you how you get those things. It doesn't tell you, it tells you the structure, not how you shift towards those things. There doesn't really seem to be any kind of strategy for linking FinOps adoption to things like broader organizational change. So like your actual broader organizational strategy as well. And there's not really any theory on how those roles actually move culture forward. So that's kind of at the strategic level. at the behavioral level, we've got lots and lots of inspiring stories. So we saw this stuff that's talking about how engineers become cost aware, finance and tech finally speak the same language. And those are great. Those are all really inspiring anecdotes, but that's kind of all they are, anecdotes. They're not mechanisms for change. It doesn't get under the hood, under the grill and tell us like, how did they actually do that? How did we get people speaking the same language? How did we get engineers to care? And that's the kind of bit that is missing. There's no repeatable model for what triggers those behavioral shifts, because ultimately been done somewhere doesn't necessarily mean it will work somewhere else. So yeah, what triggers those behavioral shifts? How are they reinforced? How do you measure adoption over time? And then lastly, there's the kind of the systemic level. So uh this is kind of the most developed area of FinOps in my mind. At this level, the guidance is kind of excellent. It's really deep. It's really technical. It's very specific. You know, hearing all the talks today, we all know how to handle billing data. We all know about rates and commitments. We all know about dashboarding. But all of those systems are kind of mechanical. They don't automatically do anything to reinforce behavior or reinforce motivation. So to me, like the learning loops of how people actually engage with that isn't there. The cultural, as I say, like the cultural architecture isn't really built in by definition. So yeah, I guess FinOps does have a how, but when you look closely, each of these layers, so strategic, behavioral, systemic, is kind of confined to its own boundary. So like strategy is shaping roles, it's not necessarily shaping mindsets. I feel like behavioral stories are there to inspire, but they're not there to help. They can't really replicate. And we've got systems that manage all of our data, but they're not necessarily actively managing the behaviors we want to see. And so what I take from that is what's missing isn't a single how, it's the connection between all of them. It's kind of the integrated cultural architecture that turns principles, people, and processes into one adaptive system of change. Yeah.
Yeah. And it might be fair to say, Dan, that, or building on what you're saying, that we've got all of these really strong parts, but they're working in isolation. They're not necessarily reinforcing each other. Or I might go so far as to say they are technically. Everything I've heard this afternoon is really strong technically, and all of those cogs in the wheel, but the bit that pulls it all together. So we're talking, some of you brave people gave me an emoji earlier. So we'll have all felt degrees of fatigue at times, whether it's like, Tesco's obviously not, because you've got a super duper tagging system that doesn't let it be inconsistent now, for which I'm very impressed. But we've all been, I'm sure before you got to that point, you had inconsistent tagging or unused dashboards or continued over provisioning. It gets a little same old, or it has the risk of getting a little same old. But the thing here is that frustration, that's not failure. That's just FinOps succeeding within the limits of its current design. So I might suggest that even if you're a big global operation, it's still operating locally, or maybe a different word would be tactically. And folks say, no, I've got a strategic FinOps function. Yes, but is it strategic from a business point of view? Is it part of the business strategy? And I know we never get a seat at the big table, but we aspire to, and we have to keep it. What I like to aspire to anyway. We have built this incredible technical engine of all of the cogs, but it feels, when it gets to this cultural change, and it comes up a lot, what are people actually doing to change the dial on the culture? We're circling the same route. We're circling the same loop, because it's human challenges, people, right? It's not systems, it's not machines. If you're feeling even remotely the same, this is maybe our sign to think about how we can approach it differently and how we can put some context around that. Back to Dan for a bit more detail.
Yeah, definitely. So this is kind of something that we've been thinking about a lot over the last 12 to 18 months. And so kind of would like to introduce something that we're calling behavioral FinOps. So to me, this is kind of the behavioral operating system It's that structural how that connects technical practice to cultural change. So yeah, for years we've been refining the engine, but we've kind of been doing it without a steering system. So we haven't been intelligently creating the outcomes we want to see necessarily in terms of behavior. Um, and so behavioral FinOps is that steering. It's the intelligent adaptive architecture, and it's there that can help you turn data into decisions. And then that's kind of the bit that we're already doing, but then turning decisions into that sustained collective self-sustaining action.
Can you
So
bring that to life for us a bit? I love it, but it's still a bit theoretical for me, Dan. What do we mean? Give us some depth.
yeah, definitely. So ultimately, it's kind of a combination of three previously proven disciplines. So the first bit, it takes in elements of behavioral science. So this kind of helps us move from instead of talking about who should act and what should they do to deconstructing why aren't they acting in the way that we want them to. Is the blocker skill? Is it process? Is it incentive? Um, Basically, this element is all about building architectures that get the behavior your organization needs.
Okay.
It also brings in elements of systems thinking. So that reminds us that organizations are living systems, not machines. What I mean by that is that with a machine, you can put in an input and you get an expected output. I think a good example was in the Tesco Bank talk just now about the cascading effects of those rules that weren't necessarily anticipated. So uh, sometimes you could take an action that has unintended consequences, and that is the definition of a complex system. Um, and so different things like metrics, workflows, and social norms, they all shape the behaviors that we're seeing just as much as the intent behind them. And lastly, modern change design. So this to me is kind of the most important element, really, because it's all about co-designing the desired behavior. So when you talk about behavioral science, people sometimes think it's manipulative. It's about getting people to behave in ways that they wouldn't necessarily act. That's definitely not what it's about, and that's why it's really important to have people around the table and talk about the behaviors that you want and design ways with the people that you want to show those behaviors to get there. And experimenting with what works. Like just because something works in one organization doesn't mean that that's going to work in your organization, and even within one team in your organization doesn't mean that's going to necessarily work across every team. So then, experiment with what works, scale through feedback. Ultimately, you need to adapt to what is relevant for your organizational context and your organizational culture, which FinOps sometimes gets really focused on best practice, but what does that really look like when it's transplanted into your organization? So ultimately, behavioral FinOps kind of sits at the center of all of these disciplines. And when you bring them together, things start to change. So those examples that Alison mentioned up top. So when you think of dashboard fatigue, instead of designing for consumption and just data as an output, start designing for action. What specific actions do we actually want people to be able to take? And at what point do they need that information to be able to take that action? Things like inconsistent tagging. Well, let's design architecture so that we make the good behaviors that we want to see completely effortless. And then things like over provisioning, we want to make sure that we're making efficiency safe. So, successes are visible, it's reinforced, it's celebrated, and equally, when people are piloting new things, it's genuinely safe to fail. For all of these elements, basically, we kind of stop hoping for this culture of accountability. That's what we all want. We all want people to say to be accountable, but then we get to the point where we're just hoping for that. So yeah, we move away from that and we start designing. Start designing and evolving the conditions that make it happen. So yeah, we've just talked a little bit about behavioral FinOps as a synthesis of these disciplines, but I just want to take a closer look at just one aspect of behavioral science to give you a sense of what this kind of looks like in practice. So we're going to breeze through these because these are just, one, we're behind time, and two, this is just a tiny element of the overall picture, but I just want to give you an idea of this is how you can start thinking about things in a different way. And if anyone has read any of the things that I've posted on LinkedIn recently, you'll probably recognize some of this stuff anyway. But one of the most useful ideas from behavioral science is this concept It's about how people make decisions when things are complex or uncertain. So we probably all know about biases, and cognitive biases are basically shortcuts that help us move fast and minimize complexity. They're not mistakes, they're just ways that the human brain deals with this. But if we can recognize them, then we can design FinOps environments that work with human decision making rather than against it, or even better, we can use these biases to our advantage. So I'm going to do the first two, and then I'm going to hand over to Alison. But first up, we've got anchoring bias. So this is basically when the first number or reference point someone sees sets the tone for everything that follows, even if then you see data that proves that that anchor was incorrect. So this can look like things in FinOps. This can look like teams sticking with last month's forecast, the first instance type they tested, or an old budget baseline. And really, to counter that, we need to be building in the space for people to challenge those assumptions and also make it safe for them to be able to let that assumption go. So yeah, basically building the space, building refresh points like architecture reviews, reforecasts, post-migration checks, or better still, you can use intentional anchors. So you can set preset efficient defaults. This is a key element of choice architecture, so that your people are anchoring on something that you want them to use rather than something that you don't want them to use. We also have loss aversion. So loss aversion is basically our tendency to fear loss more than we value gain. So if I say to you that I'm gonna give you £10, you're not gonna value that, or that's not gonna weigh as much in your mind as if I say I'm gonna take £10 from you, because you already own that £10. It's basically why teams keep idle environments running just in case, because they're afraid of the consequences that will be of things going wrong. Even if the data, you've got utilization data to show that it's not needed. So the way you counter this bias is by quantifying the risk and reframing the narrative. And the way you can potentially reframe that is, instead of saying we could save 10,000, engineers might not necessarily be motivated by the savings element, but if you say we're losing 10,000 a month by not right sizing, that is a more powerful way of framing it, because and it brings in loss aversion to your advantage. It's the same logic, but then the framing changes the motivation. Over to you, Alison.
And so moving on, another type of bias, and these are, as Dan said, these are just snippets. They're one little bit of one little bit of one little bit, just to make it real, but bearing in mind that this isn't just the whole gamut. So availability bias, this is a really common one, and it's that tendency to either overreact or respond to what is most recent or vivid in your mind. So I would imagine there's probably been some overreactions in the world, in the AWS world, following the outage earlier this week, and they'll be unfounded, but they're based on that most recent or most vivid. So the antidote, what are you going to do? You've got to step back. You've got to give data instead of anecdotes. You've got to try. But if you don't acknowledge that it is that bias that is causing the challenge, you're just kind of pushing at it instead of pushing around it. If you're trying to drive change, you can also use it to your advantage, highlighting a recent success story, make the progress feel really tangible. Moving on to the last one, status quo bias. This is probably the hardest, but the most familiar one to everyone. It's a common theme that change is uncomfortable. Lots of teams stay with what they know. How do we get around it? Well, design the solution to have make the right thing the default thing. Easier said than done, but if you stare into it. So some of these, if you pick it apart, some of these activities or approaches will be done without understanding that you are working against or with the status quo bias, or you're being aware of it. So what we're trying to do is just kind of bring them to life, because the more you focus in on them, the more you go, okay, I will word it this way, or I will approach it in that way. And because we're dealing with people, right? So you need to have quite a wide toolbox in order to encourage and get good outcomes. And it's that whole thing of when the easiest option is the optimized one, inertia starts working for you, not against you. If you get that norm, that habit to be a good habit, you're all good. Now, these biases, this little area that we've chosen to explore this afternoon, they don't make people irrational, they just make them human. But understanding them is what lets us build systems that work with how people really think instead of fighting against it. Why aren't they looking at this? Why aren't they paying attention to that? Well, maybe we could do something different. Behavioral FinOps isn't about changing people, as Dan said. It's about designing the environments where good decisions come naturally. So just a glimpse into one teeny weeny bit of behavioral FinOps to help us design for how people really think and how they might act. So let's just zoom it back up a bit. So if I think back to the early days of FinOps and where we've come from and where we've got to, such significant progress. I mean, it's just huge. We've made the invisible visible. But visibility by itself, I've been in lots of the talks this afternoon, that doesn't change behavior. I remember back at the beginning, it was all about if you made things visible, it would change behaviors. I had the very luckiness to be able to work with a fabulous man called Mike Coates. And he always used to say to me, our job is we hold a mirror up to our consuming areas, our engineering teams or something. And I always thought it was really good. And the point being, we're not making a judgment on them. We might be, but that's not our purpose. We are letting them see what they're doing. Really, really sound, really true. But what if they don't look in the mirror? You kind of know further forward. So that's the distinction now. That's when we get to the harder stuff. We're suggesting if we use behavioral economics to encourage them to look in the mirror. Real change happens when strategy, systems, and behavior align. When we stop seeing culture happens after the work has been done. How many projects or programs have I seen where we'll just implement the framework and the disciplines and the processes and everything, and then we'll do culture at the end, or we'll just tag it on, and then it's like, oh, culture hasn't really changed. Everyone's still doing the same thing. No surprise, because it's always felt a bit intangible. Everybody agreed the culture needed to shift or change, but they didn't know how to tackle it. So FinOps gave us the practice of cloud cost management, but the next step is to kind of build that behavioral engine to make the practice last. That's how we turn insights into action. It's how action becomes the habit that I mentioned, and that's how discipline becomes something that's self-sustaining. My recollection of conversations and either the first version of the book or even the second version and various events I've been at, the sum total of conversations around culture change talked about maybe having a leaderboard, or if you're in a slightly more boisterous organization, you might name and shame and show those, and you would get some internal competition going, or gamification, and you're all celebrating success. They were all under that same banner of they all feed in, they're all part of this, but they can also turn people off, and they'll turn people off because they've been approached in the wrong way, because the behavior and the impact of the behavior hasn't been understood. You're kind of, again, still pushing against it instead of flowing with it. But that's as far as it went for tackling culture change. It was really important to us to be able to build a framework, something that was tangible about how we would do it, because it's dead good to, we're in consultancy. Those of you that know me know that I'm ex-industry, but now I've got the consultant hat on. I need to show people how we will do things. We need to have a framework. And as Dan said, we've been working on it the last sort of he's been working on it the last 12, 18 months, building this up. How do we do it? What is tangible? What is real? And it's that framework. And we just wanted to just give you a tip of the iceberg to show that there can be a construct to help behavioral economics. It's no longer magic that you hope might happen if you keep talking about it. With the aid of something along the lines of a behavioral FinOps framework, bit of a mouthful, I know, but then we get to build that cultural architecture that we all want to see. So thank you ever so much for listening. I did say, as I jumped right in at the beginning, a slightly different subject, but we'll move on to the next folks. Over to you, Victor, and if there's anything, we'll pick it up in the chat.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time,
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks, Dan. I think it was an amazing presentation and very, very different from what we had. So I am going to open for votes. I think you are going to have a great rating
Are we
in
allowed
advance.
to vote?
Yeah, you're not.
Tens all the way.